On this trip, we took a cruise on the Silver Whisper, visiting 5 different cities around the Baltic Sea. We flew initially into Copenhagen, staying 2 nights in a hotel. Probably Copenhagen's most famous attraction, the Little Mermaid, has been shipped to Shanghai as the centrepiece of the Danish pavilion at the 2010 World Expo. In her place is this rather poor quality live video link from Shanghai. Fortunately, everything else that we expected to see in Copenhagen still seemed to be there. We started our sightseeing at the picturesque harbour of Nyhavn and took a guided tour around the canals. It was a great way to get an overview of the city and some of its main sights. This is their modern opera house and the royal palace with the marble church in the background. This modern extension to the National Library is known as the Black Diamond. And the old stock exchange building with its distinctive twisted spire. The canal boat goes under some extremely low bridges and has to navigate one almost impossibly tight turn. Copenhagen's a very compact city. These King's Gardens and Rosenborg Castle were just a couple of 100 metres north from our hotel, and the Botanical Gardens, which weren't terribly interesting, were just across the road from the Rosenborg Castle. A short walk east from there took us through an area of 17th and 18th century naval barracks, and then to Castellet, a very well preserved 17th century citadel with a surrounding moat and a windmill within the grounds. On the southern edge of the citadel, and very close to where we would pick up our cruise ship the next day, is St Albans English Church and a statue and fountain of a Nordic goddess and 4 oxen. The 400-year-old round tower is very unusual in having, instead of a staircase, a spiral ramp. But the best views of the city are from the top of the spire of Our Saviour's Church. The outside winding staircase gets narrower and narrower as you get near the top. From the top you can see right across to Malmö in Sweden, and the long bridge between Denmark and Sweden, which at one point disappears into the sea to become a tunnel. On our second evening in Copenhagen, we visited Tivoli Gardens. Much of it is an old-fashioned pleasure garden, with gardens, waterfalls, and concert hall. But there are also some quite modern theme park rides, as well as many restaurants. We also got to see a replica of the Little Mermaid, which the sculptor's family have lent to Tivoli Garden while the original was in Shanghai. The next day we joined our cruise ship and set off, spending a day at sea before reaching Talinn, the capital of Estonia. The cruise company organised a number of tours in Tallinn, including one that looked quite fun, on this old Russian bus, complete with tour guide in Russian army uniform, looking suitably stern. But we decided to tour the old town on our own, using a self-guided walking tour that I'd printed from the internet. Our tour started at this watchtower known as Fat Margaret. There are large sections of well-preserved medieval walls and watchtowers. The old town is on 2 levels. We entered at the lower level, and here you can see people at a viewpoint looking down from the upper part of the old town. So we climbed up to the top and toured the 3 different viewpoints that look out in all directions across the old and new parts of Tallinn. It was a lovely warm sunny day, and we spent about 5 hours walking around, including a couple of brief refreshment stops. The upper part of the town is also a home to the Russian Orthodox Alexander Nevsky Cathedral. Returning to the lower part of the old town, we visited the large town square and town hall, and made our way along St Catherine's Passage here, and back out through a different gate in the walls, and walked back to our ship. That night, our ship sailed the 170 nautical miles east along the Gulf of Finland to St Petersburg in Russia. The large sign at the mouth of the Neva River still says Leningrad. Although the name of the city was changed back to St. Petersburg in 1991, they still haven't quite got round to changing the sign. We then passed through by far the biggest port area I've ever seen, although most of the equipment seemed to be standing idle. Being a fairly small cruise ship, we were able to continue up along the river until prevented from going any further by this bridge, and we docked right in the centre of the city at the English embankment. We didn't have individual Russian visas, so we could only leave the ship on organised tours. On our first morning, we got an overview of the city, travelling partly by coach, but mostly by boat on canals and on this wide stretch of the Neva River beside the Peter and Paul fortress. That afternoon, we did a tour of 3 different churches, the first being the Peter and Paul Cathedral that we'd seen earlier from our canal boat. This cathedral is now a museum and is the burial place for the Tsars and their close families. The Peter and Paul Cathedral also features a rather unusual conversion of buses into toilets. The second church we visited, and by far the most spectacular, was the Church of Our Saviour on Spilled Blood. With its ornate and multicoloured domes and other ornamentation, it wouldn't look out of place in Disneyland or as a Las Vegas casino. The name of the church refers to the blood of Tsar Alexander II, who was assassinated on the site of the church in 1881. The interior is equally stunning. Almost every surface is covered with brightly coloured icons, which are actually mosaics. The third and final church we visited on this first afternoon tour was St. Isaac's Cathedral, and while our tour guide was buying the tickets, Margaret helped out. The scale of St. Isaac's is impressive, but after seeing the Church of Our Saviour on Spilled Blood, it seemed nothing special. On the morning of our second day in St. Petersburg, we visited the Hermitage Museum, housed within the enormous Winter Palace. Margaret and I aren't keen on long museum visits, so we picked an overview tour that took us through a broad selection of the hundreds of rooms at quite a brisk pace. The art in the Hermitage is mainly foreign, meaning not Russian, but we were more interested in the interiors of the Winter Palace itself. As with most of the tours in St. Petersburg, we were given individual radio receivers and earphones, so that we could hear the guide clearly without having to get too close or without her having to shout. This is St. George's Hall, also known as the Great Throne Room. On the afternoon of our second day in St. Petersburg, we took a tour called Through the Eyes of Russians, intended to give us a bit of an insight into Russian daily life. We started off in a modern shopping centre, which could have been almost anywhere, and then to a food market, which had all the things we would normally expect to find, as well as quite a lot of pickled vegetables. St. Petersburg's metro stations were built after the revolution to be people's palaces. They're very grand and very clean, and with no advertising on the station platforms. After our metro ride, we were taken for a rather uninteresting vodka tasting. The tours we took were generally very good. One slightly annoying aspect was that on 3 of the tours, we were taken to one of these tourist shops and left for 30 or 40 minutes. We had lovely weather throughout our stay in St. Petersburg, and at 11:30 at night it was still reasonably light. St. Isaac's Cathedral was only 300 or 400 metres from where our ship was docked. On our third and final day in St. Petersburg, we took a tour to 2 summer palaces situated about 30 miles south of the city. First, we visited Pavlovsk Palace. The palace was built for Paul, son of Catherine the Great, at the end of the 18th century. In common with all the other buildings we'd toured, there was a member of staff present in almost every room. This woman was fairly typical of them. None of them seemed to enjoy their work. The rooms are decorated and furnished in a variety of styles, all pretty ornate. From Pavlovsk Palace, we drove the short distance through the town of Pushkin to Catherine Palace. Pavlovsk Palace had seemed quite grand, but Catherine Palace is on a different scale entirely. It was built by Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Catherine I and Peter the Great, in the middle of the 18th century. Over 100 kilograms of gold were used simply in decorating the exteriors. This was the one place we visited where we had quite a long queue to get in, and it was also quite crowded wandering around inside too. But it was certainly well worth the wait. These were by far the most extravagantly decorated rooms I've ever seen. The German army destroyed much of the palace when retreating at the end of the Second World War, but the Russians have done an amazing job renovating it. The Germans also stole the amber from the famous Amber Room, and it's only recently, in 2003, been renovated and reopened. Catherine Palace was definitely the most impressive building we saw, with the Church of Our Saviour on Spilled Blood coming a close second. At the end of our tour, we drove back into St. Petersburg, making brief stops at a memorial to the siege of Leningrad and a statue of Lenin. After 3 very enjoyable and interesting days in St. Petersburg, we sailed back down the Neva River and along the Gulf of Finland towards Helsinki. Our approach to Helsinki brought us through a narrow channel beside the 18th century Suomenlinna fortress, then through an area with lots of tiny islands, many of them inhabited, and then straight into the city centre, where we docked directly opposite the indoor food market and around the corner from a very busy outdoor market. We were met by our friends Anita and Heikki, whom we got to know in Australia, and who very kindly showed us round their home city. There are no skyscrapers in the centre of Helsinki. The skyline is dominated by 2 churches, the Lutheran Cathedral here, and the Uspensky Orthodox Church. Anita and Heikki also took us to this very unusual church with a name I can't pronounce, popularly known as the Rock Church. It's mostly underground, having been quarried out of the rock. Almost all that's visible from the outside is the copper dome. We had a quick look at this very abstract monument to the Finnish composer Sibelius, and took a walk through the covered food market, seeing lots of reindeer products and countless different types of marinated fish. We said goodbye to Anita and Heikki after lunch and had a bit of a wander round on our own before returning to the ship, which departed that afternoon, setting sail overnight to our final port, Stockholm. About an hour and a half before reaching Stockholm, we entered the huge archipelago that virtually surrounds the city, passing hundreds of islands before we caught sight of Stockholm itself. Soon after passing this rather strange sculpture and waterspout, we docked in a very central position right across from the old town known as Gamla Stan. That was the end of our cruise, and we checked into our hotel for the next 2 nights before exploring Stockholm, starting with a boat trip across to the Vasa Museum. The Vasa is a wooden ship that capsized and sank on its maiden voyage in 1628. It then lay on the seabed for 333 years before being salvaged. We thought it was much more impressive than the Mary Rose. With all these heavy wooden carvings around the deck, perhaps it's not surprising it capsized. From the Vasa Museum, we walked across the island of Djurgården, stopping to have a look at these playful red squirrels, before reaching the open-air museum of Skansen. The museum covers a large area and houses lots of examples of historic buildings from around Sweden. And in some of the buildings there are staff in costume who will happily explain, in English, about the buildings themselves and the people who lived there. Skansen is also home to a number of Swedish animals, including this large grey owl, and some brown bears. In Stockholm we bought cards that gave us unlimited use of public transport and access to museums, plus a guided boat trip. It was a warm sunny day, and the locals seemed keen to find any available perch to fit in a spot of sunbathing. The boat trip wasn't terribly exciting, but did at least give us the opportunity to sit down for an hour. It started and finished at the City Hall, which we'll come back to later. Next we took a metro train south to the Ericsson Globe, claimed to be the largest spherical building in the world. Skyview takes you in a pod right up to the top of the globe, from where there are great views over Stockholm, although difficult to photograph because of the glass. But for the best views over the old town, Gamla Stan, we returned to the City Hall and climbed a very large number of steps up the tower there. Although it doesn't have the medieval walls of Tallinn, overall we found Gamla Stan to be even more interesting than Tallinn. There are a few commercial streets with wall-to-wall restaurants and tourist shops, but mostly it's a maze of very well preserved streets and very narrow passages. At the northern end of Gamla Stan is the Royal Palace, following which, just like these guards, it was time for us to go home.